Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Clarissa Alcantara, and I'm the Director of Education for Justice with Ignatian Solidarity Network. Welcome to our second installment of Justice Educator Collective. It is a online kind of webinar series rooted in Catholic social teaching and social justice. And the hope is that we've invited a number of speakers throughout the academic year to come and just do a deep dive on a particular topic. And so we have invited Dr. Nicholas Hayes-Mota, who's going to be talking to us about community organizing, Catholic social teaching in practice. Nicholas Hayes-Mota is a Catholic ethicist, public theologian, and assistant professor of religious studies at Santa Clara University. As a scholar, his research and teaching focus on the role of religion in public life, the ethics of democratic citizenship, the history of organizing in the US, and the politics of the common good. His academic work is informed by his 15 years of experience as a practitioner and teacher of faith-based community organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation and the Leading Change Network. So thank you very much, Dr. Hayes-Mota, for joining us in this conversation, and take it away.
All right, thanks so much for introducing me, Clarissa, and thanks to you all for being here. It's great to see you. Good morning. I'm calling from Santa Clara, California, so good morning in my case, good afternoon perhaps in yours. You may certainly call me Nicholas during this conversation. We don't need to go with the formalities. I want to say a little bit this morning about community organizing, why it's important, and why it might be worth studying in a Catholic school context, what it has to offer. So to get started, I'm going to be sharing some slides with all of you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you give me a thumbs up or a verbal cue if that's coming through? That's coming through? Okay, great. So by way of beginning, I want to name something you probably don't need me to tell you, but that it's relevant to know for this conversation, which is that people in the United States and in fact around the world are losing faith in politics. And this has been a gradual trend, but it's really reached a new low at this moment in time. And so in 2023, the Pew Center conducted a pretty extensive survey of how Americans feel about our political situation. And overwhelmingly, people described themselves as frustrated, exhausted, angry, despairing. And this really extended across the political spectrum. This was not owned by people of any particular ideology or persuasion, and it extended across nearly every demographic group. So this is a pretty universal sentiment. There's just a small number of people in the US today who feel much good at all about politics. And it applies not only to to politicians, to professionals in politics. It applies to the political system as a whole. If you ask U.S. Americans, for example, how they feel about our democratic institutions, resounding answer is not good. There's not a lot of confidence our democratic institutions are going to be able to survive or address some of our more fundamental problems. So if you look at this graph, you can see just how different it is if you ask people whether they're feeling exhausted or angry versus hopeful or excited. It's pretty dispiriting. And people view politics not only as fruitless, as not really addressing their issues, their problems, but also as toxic and dispiriting. They don't like how politics feels. They don't like how political conversation feels. They don't like what they see in the news. They don't like the divisions it's creating in their own families or among their friends. And so, in a very polarized time, one of the few things Americans seem to be able to agree upon is just how bad our political situation is. Right? And in 2020, a little before this survey was released, the late Pope Francis recognized this explicitly in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And Francis named this growing despair about politics, which he rightly recognized isn't just in the US, it's really a global phenomenon in many parts of the world that have democratic systems. And he took some time to analyze some of the causes of that, which I'm not going to get much into here. But they included everything from polarization to a substitution of marketing for actual politics, to political corruption, to a continually flagging economic system, gridlock. You can just go down the list. But rather than despairing of politics, Francis called for all people of goodwill, and especially Catholics, to work together to build a better kind of politics, one truly at the service of the common good. This was one of his major calls in this encyclical. And Francis was a little specific about what he meant by that. He thought building that better kind of politics was not just something politicians should do, or not even primarily that. It was really something for ordinary people to do by working together from the ground up in what he called popular movements. He referred to popular movements a number of times in that encyclical. And Francis wasn't just talking about something abstract or ideal. He was thinking of large movements of ordinary and working class and poor people that have grown around the world in certain places, especially in Latin America. And during his papacy, Pope Francis actually convened several congresses of those popular movements and used the church as a space to host them and support them, sometimes in Rome, sometimes in other places. And in fact, as we speak today, the Vatican, under his successor, Pope Leo, is convening a jubilee of popular movements from around the world. So we have every reason to think this work of encouraging ordinary people in building up a better kind of politics is going to continue under Pope Leo as well as Pope Francis. Now, when I talked about this to some of my students in the classroom, I teach at a university before Santa Clara. I was at Boston College. One of their first reactions was, that all sounds really great in theory, but that's happening over there. Where in the United States are there any examples of the kind of thing, the better kind of politics the Pope is talking about? And that got me thinking, it's really important to figure out some examples in our own backyard. And the best example I can think of on the basis of my own research and experience now of about 15 years is the community organizing tradition. I think community organizing in the US represents that kind of popular movement politics committed to the common good that Pope Francis is talking about. And so it's no coincidence Francis actually invited community organizers from the States to the Vatican a number of times, and a group of them are there today for that Jubilee meeting. And so I think community organizing is something it's really beholden not just for Catholics, but for ordinary Americans to learn about, because it's a rare example in politically dispiriting times of what a better kind of politics might actually look like. But for Catholics, I would add, it has special interest for two reasons. First, Catholics have played a pivotal role in the history of community organizing at every level, leading it, funding it, creating some of the most important innovations in the field, and that history extends back decades. So much so that you could even consider community organizing one of the great legacies of the US Catholic Church. And then at a second level, I think community organizing is pretty distinctive in that it actually puts the core principles of Catholic social teaching into practice in a really compelling and, I would argue, effective way. So Catholics should have a special interest in community organizing, and I think Catholic students could really stand to benefit from being exposed to community organizing in this context. But the reality is most Catholics in the US are either unfamiliar with organizing, unless they're involved in it, or they have serious misperceptions about it, which is no coincidence because there's a small minority of Catholics who've actively worked to spread misinformation about organizing, to really vilify it, when it should be celebrated as one of the US Church's greatest innovations. So what I'd like to do in the rest of this webinar is get a little bit more into these points. What is community organizing? What's the Catholic connection to organizing? And how does it apply Catholic social teaching? And then introduce all of you to a resource I've put together with Education for Justice to introduce students to community organizing as a kind of Catholic social teaching in practice and as a better kind of politics. And in organizing fashion, I want to start with a little bit of my own story. How did I come to encounter organizing, and why did it make an impact on me such that I now study it professionally and I've engaged in it for 15 years? And so I've had several encounters with organizing, but one of my first encounters with organizing was in February of 2013, when I was invited to come to an organizing action by a member of my church. And he took me to a neighborhood in Boston. I lived in Cambridge, in the north of Boston at the time, and in a relatively middle-class neighborhood. And he took me to a meeting at Roxbury Presbyterian Church in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood, which is a low-income neighborhood, a historically, recently at least, African American neighborhood. Roxbury Presbyterian Church is a historically Black church in the neighborhood. And at that gathering, I found myself in a church basement with about 200 leaders from about 50 congregations all over Greater Boston. And I was really struck by a number of things about the room as soon as I walked in. The first was its diversity. There were people there from multiple faiths, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim. There were people from most racial groups in Boston, white, Black, Latino, different cultural and immigrant groups in Boston. There were people from different classes, working class, lower income, to very affluent. There were people from the suburbs, from the inner city. And there were people with different political views, as I learned over the course of that evening. And so it was a really remarkable gathering of the diversity in the city that so rarely comes together in one place, much less works together in one place. But I was also impressed by how organized people were. They were keeping to a strict agenda. They were keeping on time. There was a variety of leaders who would speak from the front of the room. It just wasn't just one or two people, and it was almost no staff for the organization. It was volunteers representing those different communities. And the organization gave us time to get to know each other. So I spent about 10 minutes having a conversation with a young Muslim father who'd brought his wife and child with him from the neighborhood there. And we got to know each other a bit. And I was impressed that the organization took the time to have us do that. But I was also impressed by what they were trying to do. This was 2013. It was a moment when some folks in the US were trying to raise taxes to pay for various public services. And this organization, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, was trying to raise taxes in the state of Massachusetts to pay for better health care, better public transit, and better education. But almost anywhere you tried to do that in the US, the moment you would even raise the issue, you'd be accused of trying to foment class warfare and pitting people against each other, pitting poor against rich, and so on. And so what was really remarkable about Greater Boston Interfaith Organization was how they approached it. They had, one, a really sound political analysis. They looked at what their possibilities were, who supported it, who was against it in the state house, how they might be approached, how the organization could work to put pressure on state legislators to move it forward. But they also had a compelling story. And so that night I heard several people get to the front of the room and speak about why they really cared about this. And there were some low-income folks, not least from that very church, who spoke to why their community urgently needed more investment in their schools, in their roads, in their transportation system, in their hospitals. But there were also very well-to-do folks from other parts of the city who spoke to why they felt a civic sense of obligation to the common good, to contribute more than they were being asked to, and why they thought their neighbors should do the same. And so that story, embodied in those people, just cut right at the knees all of those accusations of class warfare. It really presented people in solidarity across classes, committed to working for a common good together. And I was really moved by that. And as I heard that, I realized looking around, like for one of the first times in my life, that core principle of Catholic social teaching, that we all share a common good and we have an obligation to work for it, that actually felt real. It felt real in that group of people and what they were trying to do. Whereas so often to me, it had felt like an abstraction, impossibly removed from political reality, which doesn't feel like the common good at all. And that made me curious. Why is it that this way of doing things feels so much like Catholic social teaching, which I'd studied and learned about growing up, but which was very disconnected from my own experience? And whenever I've taught it to students, I've realized often feels disconnected from their experience. It feels like a set of pie in the sky ideas that doesn't have a lot to do with certainly politics as they experience it. So I began trying to learn more about organizing, starting with what organizing is. And so to put on the table, I'd like to suggest to you that a helpful way to understand organizing, there are different approaches to it, is as a form of grassroots democratic politics that has a few key characteristics. One is that organizing starts by building relationships of solidarity among ordinary and often, especially, marginalized people, whether they're marginalized by race or class or gender or neighborhood. And by building relationships, organizing creates a constituency, a group of people who literally stand together and work together in solidarity to promote common objectives. That's what I witnessed in that room that night. Organizing also doesn't just bring people together, it prioritizes developing their leadership, giving ordinary people an opportunity to exercise leadership at increasing levels of scale and responsibility, to really practice responsible citizenship for the common good. It operates at the grassroots. It starts in local communities and works through their institutions like churches, like community associations, like labor unions. Labor is another kind of organizing, which I think there was a webinar about last month. And organizing brings people together not only to build bridges across difference, although it does that, but to build collective power so that people in communities that often lack power can, by coming together, have greater power to create change in the public sphere. And then critically, organizing doesn't come into a community with some idea about what they need to do, which it recruits them to. Rather, it enables communities, the communities it organizes, to collectively identify the problems they face, analyze those problems, develop a strategy to address them, and then actually work to enact that strategy to create solutions, which can take any number of forms. So you put those pieces together, you have what I mean when I talk about community organizing. That also means organizing is different from some things it's often confused with. And when teaching it, I think it's often important to distinguish it because people often hear organizing and they think one or another thing that it's actually not. One thing organizing is not is it's not direct service. It's not volunteering in a soup kitchen or clothing or a clothing dispensary or a homeless shelter. Those are all very important ways people often practice their values, their faith, but they're different than organizing. They're really about addressing people's immediate needs rather than bringing a community together to build power to address the roots of those needs, right, which organizing is. Organizing is also not the same as mass protest. We had some big protests last weekend with the No Kings rallies all over the country. Those can play a very important role, and sometimes people organize and do participate in mass protests. But protests are an example of mobilizing. They bring people together really quickly, but then after they often disperse. They don't build long-term relationships of solidarity that create that kind of constituency I was talking about. Protests can be a tool in organizing, but they're a little different than organizing, even though in my experience, people often assume the two are the same or similar. Organizing is also not advocacy. It's not about going to politicians and advocating on behalf of some community or on behalf of some issue. Organizing is about building power in the community with the problem itself, so it can address that problem. It's not for, it's among, and it's with the people who are being organized. And that's a really important distinction. And then organizing is also not partisan politics. Most community organizations, not all, but most, don't have a political affiliation. They try to bring people together across political lines, and they engage sometimes confrontationally with politicians of both parties, because neither party has a monopoly on representing or not representing community interests. And often, whoever's in power needs wake-up calls from local communities, state communities, to hold them accountable to the public interest and the common good. So organizing is not partisan politics, and in our very polarized times, that's a big point in its favor. So I want to say a little bit, and I can say more about this later, about the Catholic history of organizing, which I mentioned earlier, and which the resource we created brings to the foreground. Community organizing is often associated, especially with a very influential organizer named Saul Alinsky, who was born in 1909 and operated as an organizer from the 30s to the early 70s, principally in Chicago. Alinsky is a very controversial figure, and there are some people out there who will actively try to convince you that he was, if not literally, very close to literally the devil. He famously dedicated one of his books, with a little bit of a wink and a grin, to the first radical Lucifer, and people have made quite a lot of hay out of that. But Alinsky, in spite of what his detractors say, although he was himself a secular person of Jewish ancestry, spent most of his life working primarily with Catholics and was deeply respected and even loved by many of the Catholics in his life, some of whom were quite prominent. And so, from his very first organizing project in Chicago's Back of the Yards neighborhood, which was overwhelmingly Catholic, Alinsky built essentially a lifelong career organizing in primarily Catholic communities. And his very first project in Chicago won him the admiration of Chicago's popular auxiliary bishop, Bernard Shiel, who was a national figure at the time. He ran the Catholic Youth Association organization of the US. It also won him the admiration of one of the most important Catholic philosophers in the 20th century, Jacques Maritain, who became a lifelong friend of Alinsky and promoted his work across Europe and even to the Pope during the 1950s and 60s. It won him the admiration of Monsignor John O'Grady, who was a longtime director, national director of Catholic Charities, and funded a lot of Alinsky's early projects in Catholic communities because he thought they were the best way of addressing poverty, which was the mission of Catholic Charities. It also won him eventually the admiration of the television personality Fulton Sheen, a very popular figure in Catholicism during the 50s and 60s, who was a champion of an organization Alinsky built in Rochester, New York called Fight. Sheen had a Fight button, although not a lot of people knew about it after the fact, and he publicly supported them. Alinsky trained a number of Catholics through his work. He worked in a number of cities, although he was based in Chicago. And one of the Catholic priests he trained, who became one of his crack proteges, was a Catholic priest named Monsignor Jack Egan, who went on to be a leader not only in community but in labor organizing and a major figure in the social justice wing of the Catholic Church. One of Alinsky's organizers in Chicago, named Fred Ross, found and developed Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who both came out of Alinsky's organization, the Industrial Areas Foundation, where they got their start in the late 40s, early 50s, before they went on to found the United Farm Workers, for which they're much more famous, which used community organizing tools in a new context. And there's a great new documentary about Ross and Chavez and Huerta. I don't have Ross up here because he wasn't Catholic, but he, like Alinsky, worked closely with Catholics. And so I'd encourage you to check it out if you're curious. And then Alinsky also trained an organizer named Ed Chambers, who was a former Benedictine seminarian, who went on to inherit Alinsky's organizing training network called the Industrial Areas Foundation after Alinsky died in 1972. So if you look at the people Alinsky worked most closely with, you will find an overwhelming number of them were Catholics, very committed Catholics, and some pretty high-level Catholics. And many of the people who inherited Alinsky's legacy after he died were likewise Catholics. And so Catholic organizing after Alinsky has remained strong and passed through now 2 or 3 generations. In 1969, a group of Catholic priests and bishops with ties to Alinsky founded the Catholic Campaign for Human Development to fund community organizing projects around the US, dedicated to economic and racial justice. And for about 3 decades, the CCHD was the single biggest funder of faith-based organizing in the US, not only Catholic organizing, although sadly the bishops have rolled it back some in the last few years. One of the key leaders who reinvented organizing in the 70s in San Antonio, Texas, Ernie Cortez, was a Chicano Catholic organizer who worked very closely with a number of Catholic women religious like Sister Christine Stevens and Sister Pearl Caesar, to really build an even more deeply faith-based kind of organizing that grew out of San Antonio, spread through Texas, especially in Latino Catholic communities, and then it became the model that a number of other organizations used around the US. A Jesuit named Father John Bauman adopted that model and spread it widely through his own organizing network, PICO, now known as Faith in Action, which remains very closely tied to the Jesuit order. Jose Carrasco was a student of Cortez who really developed the philosophy and theology of the PICO network. Mary Gonzalez and Greg Galuso, who is a former Jesuit himself, built another network, the Gamaliel Network, which was incidentally the network that trained Barack Obama when he was a community organizer, also deep ties to the Catholic Church. That network is now run by another Catholic laywoman, Ana Garcia Ashley, who's inherited its leadership. And this is just a sampling of just how deeply Catholics have shaped organizing over the course of its history since Alinsky. So it was founded by an agnostic and at times quite irreverent Jewish organizer, namely Saul himself. the Catholic Church has really been deeply involved in organizing, and organizing itself has been built and developed by a lot of Catholics, men and women, lay and ordained, um, and really supporting it at every level. And yet, for the majority of Catholics, as I mentioned, this story is largely unfamiliar. And so I think there's a really valuable role for teachers as well as organizers and priests to tell that story and expose people to it. Last thing I want to say before I stop yakking and give you a chance to talk is that organizing has attracted Catholics, not just because it's a general way of doing social justice, but because it seems an especially integrated way of putting all of the core principles of Catholic social teaching into practice. Starting with the dignity of the person. Alinsky himself identified dignity as the single most important value for any community organizer. He calls it the organizer's guiding star. And at its core, organizing is a practice not just for making change in the world, but for waking people up to their own dignity and what they're entitled to by virtue of that dignity, and giving them the sense of agency, but also the sense of responsibility that follows from that dignity. Realizing you can actually make a difference in the world and change the society around you so that it better comports with your own dignity. You have a voice, you have power, right? And as a gay person who's often been told I don't have dignity, organizing is the single place where I have found it most and been awakened to my own. So I can personally attest to that dimension of the practice. Organizing is also a practice explicitly centered on the common good. It brings people together to identify their common goods, and then it helps them to build the solidarity and the power to achieve that common good. And as I mentioned earlier, it actually works by building solidarity, building relationships that last across various kinds of difference, so people can take action together for the common good. Exactly what solidarity in the Catholic tradition means. Organizing also embodies that somewhat wonkier principle of Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity, in that it's a way of giving local communities and even local institutions the agency and the power to address their own problems, right? Rather than relying on big institutions, federal government, large nonprofits, corporations, to address those problems for them, when often they don't really know what the problems of local communities are, or they don't understand it well. Organizing reverses that direction. It builds politics from the ground up, and it gives those closest to the problem the agency and the responsibility to address it, exactly as subsidiarity in practice is supposed to mean. And then finally, organizing really puts into practice Catholic social teaching's preferential option for the poor. It's not just doing for the poor, for those who are marginalized or excluded. It's actually giving them the power, the voice, and the agency to take action for themselves in solidarity with others, to address their needs and really to address the wider needs of society. And at a moment when I would say Pope Leo XIV has just affirmed the preferential option for the poor more clearly, even than Pope Francis in his first document last week, De Lexite, um, centering that, the preferential option for the poor, is a really important thing at the moment. And organizing has been doing it since the 1930s, really, through working in working class communities, poor communities, racially marginalized communities over the course of decades. So one doesn't need to look to Latin America or liberation theology to find examples of how this has been put into practice. It's been happening in our own backyard in the US, but as I said, too many Catholics don't know the story yet. So that's where I'm going to stop for my initial presentation. I think Clarissa has some questions for us to talk about.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicholas. I put a bunch of links in the chat and then someone messaged me and was like, did you realize that you dropped the same link multiple times? So the last link, if you have been here for a little bit, is the link that actually takes you to the resource that Nicholas is going to be walking us through. So if you'd like to go ahead and download that just to have in the background, I will put us into small groups, and this gives us a chance just to chat. I'll type the questions in the chat as well and kind of message you. But sometimes I find with a presentation that I'm getting to know, sometimes it's helpful just to take a beat, have a minute or two, and then just kind of think through what I'd heard. So I'll give us probably 7 or 8 minutes since we've got smaller groups today. I'll give us about 7 or 8 minutes to kind of answer these questions. And it's okay if you don't have any experience with Catholic organizing. Know that we plan this knowing that people would come in with a range. And if you've not had that experience, don't feel like you can't participate in the small group. And so the two questions are, how does this presentation so far fit into your experience of organizing? And what is a concept or phrase that you're going to take away from this time that you maybe want to share with someone in your community? And so the first question is, how does this presentation fit into your experience of organizing? If you've never done it, if you're curious about it, if you've done it before, any and all answers are correct. And then the second question is, what is a concept or phrase that you want to take away from this time and kind of share with somebody? All right. You always know it's a good small group session when you hit the 60-second timer and folks are enjoying the conversation, which is great, which is what we kind of were hoping for and what we wanted. I've put the links to both the presentation and the resource document in chat. Normally, I will share kind of one of the things that we do with our EFJ membership is that we only give resources to members. And so if you are not an EFJ member and you happen to be here live, then you get a free treat, I suppose, by getting access to the resource. If you haven't received it already, send me a DM and I'll slide you the link. I've put it a couple times, so many links, so feel free to access that. But this is kind of the portion of the time that we bill as ask all the questions you want. And feel free to take yourself off mute. And if you've got a question or a comment or something that you'd like to kind of get clarified, this is kind of the time to do it. The floor is yours. And we'll do this for a little bit and then we'll come back. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Hi, everybody. Tiffany Swan, commentator here in Chicago. I have to get off for another meeting here in just a few seconds, but I just wanted to thank Clarissa for making this presentation available to those of us who are members and non-members. I think this is very important. I wish I had more time to stay on with you. Nicholas, you're amazing. Thank you. God bless you for the work that you're doing and for what you're sharing with us. And it resonated so very much with me. I not only am a chaplain at a Catholic high school, St. Ignatius College Prep here in Chicago, but I'm also a member of Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership, which is a faith-based organizing. You probably know
I'm talking with Michael this
Yeah,
afternoon.
I'm sure you are all colleagues. I'm sure there was ties there. So, but I just want, as I told in my small group, that learning the history of the movers and shakers in the Catholic Church behind community organizing was so powerful. I've heard some of the names before, but that's my biggest takeaway from your presentation. I thank you so much for that, and I see so much fruit there to share with other Catholics who are sitting in the pews waiting for something to happen. If they just knew who what our church has done in the past and the importance of Catholic social teaching. Because for me, I didn't really come to know about Catholic social teaching until I was in I would say my 30s, and I had been confirmed when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, 15, something like that. And to me, it's just a set of principles that everyone should live by. Sometimes I hate the fact that it's called Catholic social teaching. It should be human social teaching, basically. So, um, but we have so much in our history as Catholics that to share, and this also enhances my education with. I'm taking classes at working towards a MA in social justice at Loyola here in Chicago as well. So, thank you for enhancing my classwork. I appreciate it so very much. And everybody, I wish I could stay on longer to meet you all, but I guess, Clarissa, will there be contact information shared possibly with everybody who may want it?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and
Okay.
share that. And yeah, we understand. Thank you so much
All
for
right.
joining.
Thanks, everybody. God bless you, Nicholas. Keep up
Thank
the
you.
great work. Let's say everybody stay on the battlefield. Okay. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Tiffany. Blessings.
For those of you that requested access I went in my email and kind of clicked through, so hopefully that will populate on your screens. We'll do a couple of more minutes, for burning questions, and from there we'll leave time to walk through the resource. Questions? I've got one. So given all things today, like literally today, what are some things that, for people who do this work and, and have been doing this work, and even like in today's context, what are some things that folks can look to or like lean on for like hope? Because, it's not that an organizer has to do it all, but there's certainly a concept of like sustaining, right? To kind of move an inch, a mile, etc. So what are some things that in your own personal story that you kind of lean on for hope, or where do you find that? And like, where have others shared with you where that like hope roots itself?
And it's a great question. And I both think hope is one of the most important things. It's also a virtue, right? But I also often get frustrated when people talk about hope because it seems kind of airy-fairy. And for me, I think of a quote by Dr. Cornel West who says, hope doesn't precede action, hope follows action. For me, the sources of hope have always been very concrete. I feel hope when I'm in relationships with people whose values I share, who I trust deeply, who give me that sense of collective agency that, like, in spite of all the what, I can actually not only survive this, but I can take meaningful action to move things forward in a positive direction. And I likewise get hope from belonging to organizations, whether that is, in my case, like my local Industrial Areas Foundation organization, Silicon Valley Allied for the Common Good, or the national network of which it's a part, that give me that sense of being part of something much larger that actually has the power to make a difference and to sustain lots of those, hope-giving relationships over time. I think one thing organizing really gets right that is kind of countercultural right now, but also deeply Catholic, is the importance of institutions, to sustain our hope for the long haul. Institutions make a difference, and institutions are very unsexy, very unpopular, especially among young people right now. But I just think they're so important. So much of my hope has been carried by institutions, and including, churches, but also especially community organizations. And the last thing I'll say is, like, to that point about action, I get hope not just from any old action, but from action that feels strategic, as if there's a guiding strategy for it. It has a goal. It has a clear means and a plausible means to attain that goal. And beyond the goal, it's going somewhere further, right? So when I'm part of an organization that has a multi-year strategy that's compelling to me, that I see, how is this actually going to make a difference in the right direction? And what's my role in it? How can I be a part in it? That matters so much more than just, I mean, like, I went to the No Kings protest this weekend. I enjoyed it. But I'm already wondering, like, what's next? Got a bunch of people together, but now what's going to happen? And is there going to be any tangible impact from this? Or is it just going to be a big flash in the pan? That for me is the difference between mobilizing and organizing. You can mobilize a bunch of people and it can feel pretty cool at the time and it can even be disruptive, but then it disperses. Whereas organizing is what creates those relationships, builds those institutions, that enduring collective power that really lasts for the long haul and is capable of executing a sustained strategy. Which for me is why organizing is a practice of hope. To the extent I'm participating in organizing with people I trust in relationship, I'm as hopeful as I can be in pretty dark times. If I'm out of relationship, if I'm not participating, it's very easy to despair. And so whenever I see somebody despairing, my first thought is, how do I get you into relationship and into an institution that might actually revitalize your hope and help you take the action that will keep it alive and growing?
Thank you. Powerful. Maybe time for one more question before we head to the review or resource walkthrough, I suppose. Anyone?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Just a quick question. Nicholas, again, I just want to say thank you for this. I think it's really just been a powerful So you should learn and see this work, and its connection to Catholic social teaching. I'm a high school Catholic social teacher myself, in Baltimore, Maryland, teach theology here, and I think that's where I love that language of what this is and what this not. I think that right now a lot of our mission and identity work has been primarily service oriented, which I think is great. But the office is also about justice, and in these times, a lot of we get that little bit curving of being like, are we, what does advocacy look like, and how do we make sure that's aligned, and all that to say is, I love the idea of the history, telling the history in itself, and say this is nothing new, right? This is not me pushing an agenda. This is a return to the gospel, and use the language of Leo. Um, what would be a suggestion for maybe practical ways to maybe start organizing practice, maybe at a high school level? I got our guys going to the teaching every year, which is great. They
Yep.
have an opportunity to advocate, but like trying to make it sustained, and that's only a small subset of the entire school, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, any practical ways in which you would suggest, organizing at the high school level, just getting the ball rolling.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. It's a great question, and blessings on your work. I think the role of teachers at every level is just so important. So this dovetails with I think a question that came up in our small group with Colleen and Busy about what are some of the first steps you can take as a teacher yourself to get into organizing, and also to facilitate an encounter of students with organizing, especially because I think you were mentioning this, Colleen, like for a lot of students, the word doesn't mean anything, and it's not clear what it is. They might have a clear idea of what service is, for example, or even of what advocacy or protest is, but what's organizing? How do you experience it? And two thoughts. One is, I think looking for local organizations, and I can think of a couple in Baltimore already, um, that are community organizations that are pretty robust, that are doing good work, and trying to build a relationship with them so that you can have an organizer come in and lead a session. I'm doing that here at Santa Clara next week. We're having or not next week, the week after next week. Thank God I have a little extra time. We have an organizer coming in to lead a session where we're showing a film, actually that documentary about Fred Ross and the California organizers I mentioned. But then we're following it up with house meetings, which is this particular kind of small group meeting that Fred Ross is actually credited with inventing, that is kind of a bread and butter tool of organizing, so that people can actually experience a little bit of what one practice of organizing feels like. And then we'll debrief that, and then we'll see what people want to do. And so that actually illustrates both things I was going to say. One, I think looking for organizations and individuals within those organizations you could build a relationship to think with them, like, what could I do? What action could I bring my students to locally? Or what could you come and do for us to give us a taste, right? That I think would be one thing. The other thing is, like, a lot of people think organizing is going out there and doing something. But the practices of organizing are things you can apply in your own school, So like a house meeting, which is a small group meeting, or a one-to-one relational meeting, the most basic practice of organizing, a strategic way of having a conversation with one other person where you try to share stories, identify common values and interests, and then potential ways of acting together. That's the number one thing a professional organizer does, a bunch of those meetings every week. And you can easily do those in a school. You can teach students how to do one-to-ones, and then you can have them do them and reflect on the experience. And then maybe from those one-to-ones, figure out, well, what action could we take together in our school? Because again, organizing is not about acting for other people. It's about acting for yourself in solidarity with others, right? And there too, I think having that relationship to another organization or an organizer who could help maybe do a training there or something might be useful. But the practices of organizing are things you can actually apply in your own context. And that I think would make it more real for students because they actually develop that sense of ownership that might otherwise be missing. So that's what I'm going to try to do here, and I'm happy to to report on how it goes. But whatever you try, I'd love to hear, because I really want to get a better sense of what educators are doing to connect students to organizing, and I hope we can have more of those conversations.
Thank you.
Awesome. With that, do you mind sharing your screen and walking through the resource?
Not at all. And I think we should probably do this quick to
Yes.
respect people's time.
Yeah.
But the reality is we've gotten through a lot of the content in the resource already. So I think that yeah, we don't need to spend too long on it. But so the resource we've created is a discussion guide that basically goes over a lot of the content we went over in our session today. And this could be a great way to have an initial conversation with students about organizing. So it opens with a little framing that kind of recapitulates the framing I gave at the beginning of the session about despair in politics and Pope Francis's call for a better kind of politics, and introduces organizing as that better kind of politics. And this could easily be supplemented by looking at that Pew study, for example, or other things to show just how bad Americans feel about politics these days. I think students will relate, and maybe have a conversation about that. And then the second part of the resource really focuses on an article I wrote that's a short retelling of that Catholic history of organizing. It goes a little bit more into depth than what I was able to do today, but a lot of the same names, a lot of the same narrative. It was produced by the Matter of Spirit magazine, hosted by the Interfaith Peace and Justice Center out of Washington, and looks nice. It has some great photos. And so the idea here is that article, after kind of introducing and contextualizing it, could be a great focal point for a discussion about organizing, what it is, what its history is, what its connection to Catholicism is, and thinking about how it speaks to our present moment. Right? This article in particular tells the story of Walensky's very first organizing project in the Back of the Yards neighborhood in Chicago, a Catholic, overwhelmingly Catholic neighborhood. And it also starts to get a little bit into how organizing applies Catholic social teaching. So reading the article kind of alongside maybe some instruction on the core principles of CST, if those aren't familiar already, could be a great thing to do. And then the last part of the resource focuses on kind of bringing that story up to date. So it mentions the 4 major faith-based organizing networks, which are the Industrial Areas Foundation, Faith in Action, Gamaliel, and DART. And then it tries to go through how organizing works in a little bit more detail, starting with relationship building, then the democratic choice of issues, the way strategy is developed, what forms of collective action organizing might take, and then the priority of given to leadership development. And it asks a few further questions there. And these are all things that could be further supplemented by actually bringing an organizer in to talk, or looking at kind of a how-to guide. There are a number of how-to guides that get in more depth into like these particular practices of organizing. The practices I was talking about earlier, one-to-ones and house meetings, are exactly the kind of thing you could actually teach people to do in a session and then give them an experience of it. And maybe, Clarissa, we can develop a resource on that. I know we've talked about that, for folks who'd like something more applied. And then there are some reflection questions. And then finally, the resource concludes with a prayer for community organizers and community builders, which I think does a really beautiful job of reminding us what it's all about. So that's the resource. It will give you kind of an operational way to dig more into what we went over today with students. And if there are further ways we could develop it or supplement it, I really care about providing resources for teachers interested in this. And so, whatever further I could do, please give me your feedback.
Thank you so much. And that was indeed a quick walkthrough. We're 3 minutes over. I appreciate you all staying, and I know you probably have very busy schedules, afternoons, mornings, etc., wherever you're joining us. So I will take this moment to say thank you so much to Nicholas, and thank you to all of you for kind of joining. If you would like a copy of the resource, again, if you haven't seen it already, send me an email and I'll send it to you. And we're going to do this again sometime in early winter and talking about Black Catholics with Dr. Tia Noel Pratt. But as you say goodbye, please enter in the chat one thing that you hope to take away or one thing that you learned, and that'll, just kind of help us see and say goodbye to each other, and just hear what we all did. So thank you all so much for joining.